In the early hours of May 1945, long columns of vehicles stood motionless along German roads. Engines were cold. Fuel tanks were empty. Canvas covers hung loose in the rain. Some trucks were parked neatly in rows, others abandoned where they had stopped in forest tracks, village streets, or the edges of shattered autobahns. Many still bore unit markings and faded Balkan Cruise symbols. No orders came, no drivers returned. For the first time in years, the machinery of German logistics was silent. At that moment, the European war had effectively ended. By spring 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing on every front. Allied armies were deep inside Germany. Rail networks were destroyed. Fuel production had fallen to a fraction of pre-war levels. The German army, which once depended on vast numbers of wheeled vehicles to move men, ammunition, food, and fuel, no longer existed as an organized force. What remained was an enormous physical residue of war, hundreds of thousands of military trucks scattered across Europe. Germany entered the Second World War in 1939 with a logistical system already under strain. Unlike the United States or Britain, Germany never fully motorized its armed forces. In 1939, more than half of German divisions still relied heavily on horses. Yet the Wehrmacht increasingly depended on trucks as the war expanded across thousands of kilometers from the Atlantic, coast to the outskirts of Moscow, from the Arctic Circle to North Africa. By 1941, Germany had pressed nearly every available civilian truck into military service and launched emergency production programs to standardize designs. By 1944, the situation was critical. Allied bombing had devastated German industry. Synthetic fuel output collapsed after attacks on hydrogenation plants in mid-1944. Spare parts were scarce. Rubber shortages, limited tire production. Despite this, German factories had produced or requisitioned an estimated 600,000 to 700,000 military trucks during the war, ranging from light 2-ton cargo vehicles to heavy 5- and 6-ton haulers. These trucks were spread across occupied Europe, often far from repair facilities, running on minimal maintenance. The scale of this vehicle fleet was immense. Trucks formed the backbone of German supply columns, artillery, transport, engineer units, and mobile headquarters. A single infantry division required several thousand horses and several hundred trucks to function. Panzer divisions depended even more heavily on motor transport, not just for fuel and ammunition, but for spare parts and recovery vehicles. By late 1944, many divisions existed largely on paper, while their remaining trucks were either immobilized or destroyed by air attack. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Allies inherited this vast and chaotic inventory. Trucks were found in every condition imaginable. Some were relatively new, built in 1943 or 1944. Others dated back to the early 1930s. Many had been cannibalized for parts. Others had been deliberately sabotaged by retreating units' engines, ruined, gearboxes damaged, fuel systems destroyed. Large numbers had simply run out of fuel and been abandoned intact. Allied recovery teams moved quickly. In the western zones, American and British forces cataloged captured vehicles as part of broader disarmament and demilitarization efforts. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps and Ordnance units inspected thousands of German trucks in Germany, France, the Low Countries, and Italy. British teams did the same in their zones. In the East, Soviet authorities seized vehicles as reparations, often transporting usable trucks back across Eastern Europe. Initial Allied assessments were mixed. German trucks were generally considered mechanically simple and rugged, but inferior to Allied equivalents in terms of standardization and ease of maintenance. The German reliance on many different manufacturers and models, Daimler-Benz, Opel, MAN, Henschel, Bussing, NAG, Ford work had created a logistical nightmare even before defeat. For Allied planners, this lack of standard parts made long-term use unattractive. Fuel compatibility was another problem. German engines were designed for octane fuel, often using wood gas or substitute fuels late in the war. While this was an advantage under German shortages, it complicated integration into Allied systems. Tire sizes, electrical systems, and braking standards also varied widely. In many cases, The effort required to keep these trucks running outweighed their immediate value. Nevertheless, in the immediate post-war months, German trucks were used extensively. Hauled rubble? In devastated cities, they hauled rubble, food, and displaced civilians. Allied military governments pressed any serviceable vehicle into temporary use. In some areas, German civilian drivers were retained under Allied supervision to operate captured trucks for reconstruction tasks. In 1945 and 1946, these vehicles were often the only means of large-scale transport available. The longer-term fate of most German military trucks was far less favorable. As occupation policies solidified, demilitarization became a priority. Trucks clearly identified as military assets were stripped of weapons mounts, radios, and markings. Many were declared surplus almost immediately. The Allied Control Council authorized widespread scrapping to prevent any future rearmament and to recover scarce raw materials. Steel shortages in post-war Europe were severe. Germany's cities lay in ruins. Railways, bridges, and factories needed rebuilding. Scrapping military vehicles provided a ready source of steel, copper, and aluminum. Large vehicle dumps were established where trucks were dismantled systematically. Engines were removed, frames cut apart, and usable components separated. By 1947, tens of thousands of trucks had been reduced to raw materials. Not all vehicles met this fate. Some German trucks were transferred to civilian use, particularly in agriculture, forestry, and construction. In West Germany, Allied authorities permitted limited redistribution of trucks to essential industries. These vehicles were often repainted, rebuilt, and operated for years after the war. In rural areas, former Wehrmacht trucks became farm haulers or timber vehicles, sometimes still bearing traces of their wartime origins. In Eastern Europe, the story was different. The Soviet Union treated captured German vehicles primarily as reparations. Large numbers of trucks were shipped east, often with minimal documentation. Some were absorbed into Soviet civilian fleets. Others were used by Eastern Bloc armies in the late 1940s, particularly in countries with limited industrial capacity. Maintenance was difficult, and most were eventually scrapped as spare parts ran out. Investigations into German vehicle production were conducted alongside broader Allied technical surveys. The U.S. Army's post-war technical missions examined German automotive engineering, focusing on manufacturing methods rather than specific vehicle models. They concluded that Germany had prioritized production speed and resource substitution over durability and long-term maintenance. This approach had allowed Germany to field large numbers of trucks quickly, but left them vulnerable to sustained operational use. One finding stood out repeatedly in Allied reports: the German failure to standardize. Whereas the U.S. Army relied on a small number of standardized truck types produced in enormous quantities, Germany fielded dozens of models with overlapping roles. This fragmentation increased training requirements, complicated repairs, and strained supply chains. In the post-war analysis, German trucks were seen less as technological achievements and more as symptoms of an overstretched industrial system. By the early 1950s, very few original German military trucks remained in service anywhere in Europe. Economic recovery, particularly under the Marshall Plan, brought new vehicles and modern production methods. West German industry rebuilt itself around civilian automotive manufacturing, not military transport. East German industry followed a different path, producing standardized vehicles under Soviet influence. In both cases, the wartime truck fleet faded rapidly from daily life. Today, surviving examples are rare. A small number of restored German military trucks exist in museums and private collections, often reconstructed from multiple wrecks. Their survival owes more to post-war scarcity and later historical interests than to any deliberate preservation effort. Most were never seen as artifacts worth saving. They were tools of war, and once their purpose ended, they were dismantled without ceremony. The historical meaning of Germany's military trucks lies not in their individual designs, but in what they reveal about the war itself. They illustrate the gap between ambition and capacity. Germany sought to wage a modern, mobile war across continents, but lacked the industrial depth and fuel resources to sustain it. Trucks bridged that gap temporarily, but only at immense cost and with diminishing returns. They also highlight a broader lesson of the conflict. Wars are not decided by weapons alone, but by logistics. German trucks carried divisions forward in the early years of the war. Later, their absence or their immobilization marked the limits of German power. By 1945, the silent rows of abandoned vehicles told the story of a system that had exhausted itself. In the end, what happened to Germany's military trucks after the war was unremarkable, but telling. They were counted, stripped, used briefly, and then dismantled. Their steel was melted down and reshaped into the foundations of a new Europe. Roads were cleared, cities rebuilt, the machines that once carried war were absorbed back into peace, leaving little trace beyond rusted fragments and faded photographs. The roads where they stood are quiet now. Grass has grown where convoys once waited. The trucks themselves are gone, but their absence speaks as clearly as their presence once did.